of Residential Schools in Canada. This is a webinar that is part of the Walking Together Alberta Teachers Association Education for Reconciliation project, which is Alberta Teachers Association's commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action and the joint commission that the ATA signed with Alberta Education and other stakeholders to ensure that all teachers in the province and all students in the province learn about the history of residential schools. So thank you again for joining us today, and we will get started. Before we get into the workshop and introducing ourselves, of course, we want to acknowledge this is a beautiful day on Treaty 6, and I'm coming to you from Barnett House here in Edmonton, and Treaty 6 the Alberta Teachers Association would like to acknowledge where I am today is in the boundaries of which is in Saskatchewan, covering large portions of central Alberta and central Saskatchewan. It encompasses the reserve lands of 18 First Nations bands. There's the Plains Cree First Nations. Treaty 6 also includes traditional territories of the Dene Siouxland First Nations, the Nakota, the Saulteaux, and of course the Métis Nation. We would like to acknowledge the traditional knowledge holders and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. And it is in their honor that we are learning about residential schools today. So we have 5 participants today. That's excellent. If you are returning from the first session, I'd like to know that and see how much we have to go into a review of last day. Or if you're a new participant, that'll just help me frame the first part of our time together. So if you, Dan pulls up your toolbar for you, it'd be really great to have you let me know if you're returning from the first session, a little hello and where you're from in the top component, or if you are new. Before we do that, again, my name is Cheryl Devon. My maiden names are Henderson and Hawk. I am Métis. I'm Red River Métis. My family came from the Red River settlement. We first settled in Fort Saskatchewan after the uprising in Red River. And from Fort Saskatchewan, we branched out to the Andrew area, to Ashmont, to St. Paul, and to the beautiful Lac La Biche area. I've taught up in Lac La Biche, started my teaching career many, many moons ago, and am now a teacher with Edmonton Public Schools, and I've been seconded to the ATA Walking Together Reconciliation Project. I'm so happy that you're joining me today. And I'd just like to acknowledge the pictures on the side, my beautiful boys, and my father, my uncle, my aunt, my grandparents, the reason why I walk with you today on this journey and honoring my ancestors and their contributions. So our workshop goals today, we started last day with looking at 2 of the A's from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All of the Walking Together workshops follow this format that we've taken from the Truth and Reconciliation, where they tell us that reconciliation happens with these 4 A's, with an awareness. And for us last week, that was awareness of the legal documents and the underlying policies that led to residential schools, with acknowledgement. And that for us last week was acknowledging the impacts that residential school had on former students. Hard thing to look and to watch, but we honor the testimonies that the brave and courageous survivors have shared with us. This week, we will look at the last 2 A's. We'll look at that atonement piece that's really critical for reconciliation to happen, that statement of apology and acknowledging that wrongs were done. And then moving into the action, we as teachers, of course, we're agents of change. If we want to do something, we're always looking for things in our classroom to help our students learn and understand. So we will be looking at a variety of resources that you could potentially use for your own personal, professional learning, or to take back with you in your classroom. Now we'll just quickly run through last week. We looked again at the acts that were in place and the government policies that were put in place at the beginning of Canadian history that led to the formation of residential schools. Because if you recall from last week, residential schools didn't just happen as a happenstance, that they were deliberate because of the policies that were put in place. And if we remember reading the acts last day in the policies, the goal of residential schools was for that assimilation, for the complete absorption of Indigenous peoples into the mainstream settler society. So we have that idea of the forceful assimilation. In fact, Justice Marie Sinclair from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called it a cultural genocide. And that was because of the goals of residential schools, as Duncan Campbell Scott once proclaimed, to kill the Indian, get rid of the Indian problem. From that, last week we looked at the location of residential schools and we examined this map. Remember, the residential schools in the location was also very deliberate, that this shows us the history of Canada and the settlement of the West, that the majority of the schools were in Western Canada. And in fact, Alberta had the largest amount of residential schools, and that was all related to settling the land, for colonization of the land, for development of the West. And the residential schools were a part of that piece to get the land for the settler population and for the formation of the country of Canada. So those were the pieces that we talked about last week. We began to look at acknowledgement of the harm, and we heard from the propaganda videos what message was being sent out to the general populace about residential schools, to help explain why this wasn't something that was generally known and understood as a country as a whole. And then we also looked at the hardest part, the survivors explaining to us their experiences in schools. And that's where we ended last week. So this week, we want to finish off looking at acknowledgement and then get into the apology and into the action. The one thing that has to be said when we are looking at the experiences of former students of residential schools, when I speak with former students, with elders, as we hear in the news lately that some students talk about positive outcomes, that they received something good from these schools. And on your screen, you can see a list of some that we've heard from survivors. Yesterday, talking with one former student saying that he loved to read and he couldn't wait to learn to read English. And he's still an avid reader today, and devours books. And he's very grateful for that. Learning trades and skills. They were the industrial schools that were originally set up to teach young Indigenous children the trades. They devolved into more of teaching the students how to be domestic help and how to be farm hands, but there were some schools that tried to teach trades to students. Some former students talk about lasting friendships, and you heard a little bit about that last week, that there was, in some instances, education that allowed students to move on to post-secondary education. And some students talk about having some positive role models from the schools and are grateful for that. And we have to acknowledge that this is a complex history and it's a complex story, and there were some positives, but we also have to think about what's in the news lately, and our senator saying that that the positives and the well intentions are being undermined by all the negative reporting of residential schools. And I just think it's important here for us to acknowledge that even if students have had positive experiences, as some former students have said to me, it did not take away from the underlying policy of residential schools of forced assimilation and of ripping students from their culture. And that is a lasting negative legacy and cannot be, I think, flippantly put aside. And we need to know that even if students had positive experiences academically, that goal of assimilation and of removing them from their culture did have a negative impact on all the students. So it's just something that we really have to be aware of. As Justice Sinclair said, the focusing in on the positives of the schools minimizes the oppression, it minimizes the violation of Indigenous people by these schools, and dismisses the goal of what he openly calls cultural genocide. So we need to acknowledge the whole truth that there were some positive aspects that some students talk about, but we also cannot let that overshadow the overwhelming harm that was done. In fact, we need to look at, as a contemporary issue, the intergenerational trauma. when we are looking at what these schools did to our Indigenous students, our Indigenous children, that the effects weren't just on the individual. In fact, these negative effects were passed on from generation to generation. And when you talk to former students who went to residential school, whose parents went to residential school, whose children went to residential schools, we saw Alice on the video last week, that these negative impacts continue through families, through communities, and then we end up seeing that result in our classrooms. So what I've put on the screen here are just a short list of impacts of residential schools on the former students and on their families and on their communities. This is just a short list. But as we look at this, I want us to really reflect on the implications of intergenerational trauma and what we see in our communities and in our schools today. And as you look at this list, I'd like you to reflect on your own classroom experience. And if we can get the little toolbar up again, Dan. I'd like us to have a look and add a mark. If we can go to that little box under the T, I believe is the one that we want. And you can pick the little X at the end. And if you, I invite you to look at this list and put an X by any of these impacts that you have seen in your classroom, in your school community. Ones that when you look at this, you say, oh, I've seen this, the result of this in my classroom. For example, poverty. I've seen a lot of results of poverty from intergenerational schools in my classroom. So I'll give you a few minutes to look through. It's pretty astonishing to look at what people are checking off and seeing how much of these negative impacts that we heard last week on the former students, how they still impact us today. And remembering too that this wasn't long ago history, that the last school closed in 1996, which means the youngest person to testify to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, she was only 27 years old. So these are the students in our classroom. These are their parents, these are their grandparents, their aunts and their uncles. So we will see within our classroom impacts from the experiences these students had at the school. So I want us to think for a minute, if these impacts are alive in our families today, then what does that mean for us as classroom teachers? What do we see in our classrooms? For example, if I think of my own experiences and people that I have talked to, one impact of these families experiencing residential schools and these traumas created by that is the families really being protective of their children and really being defensive towards schools. So, for example, if I were to answer this question, one thing that I saw in my own family would be my parents not allowing the school to be the disciplinarians for me. That they would come to the school if something was wrong with myself, my brother, my sister, and they would say, nope, these are my children, we will discipline, you do not have the authority over them, taking us home and then disciplining us at home as needed. So I'd like you to just have a look at this and think about the intergenerational trauma from the last page, and then what do we see as teachers in our classroom as a result of this? Okay, everybody, thank you for that. We can see on the screen that there are lots of impacts that we see every day in our classroom because of what the families have gone through and what the families are living with. So it just helps us be a little more aware of the students in our room and what their situation might be, where they're coming from. And if we can understand where those situations come from, that can help us maybe be a little bit creative when we're dealing with these families, when we're dealing with these students, and trying to find ways to reach out and find success for them. And it's hard work, but knowing and understanding the history can hopefully help us as a school come up with some creative ways to reach out to families, to reach out to students, and to make school be seen as a safe, caring place. as my colleague says, we are the frontline workers, and it's up to us to be able to look at the truth of the history of our families and then move forward and see what we can do to make school inviting for them. So if we know that residential schools have created not only a negative impact for the former students, but also it's carried through intergenerationally, and we see the results continue in our school communities today. What has happened to make amends for this? And so we get to the atonement for the causes. We'll first look at the government atonement, and then we'll look at ourselves as educators. So atonement to me means more than just saying sorry. So if I think of my own two children, and my one son will bug the other, and they'll come and tattle, I will say to my one son, well, there's going to be consequence. And he'll say, Mom, I'm sorry. And I'll say to him, what are you sorry for? Are you sorry for bothering your brother? Are you sorry for getting caught? Are you sorry that there's consequences? Atonement is more than just saying sorry. It's looking at what the wrong was and acknowledging that. And that's an important part for the reconciliation process to happen, for us to, as a country, collectively look at the wrongs and say that we are sorry, this was the wrong that happened. So we're going to take a few seconds to look at what the atonement meant for us as Canadians. First, there was the Indian Residential School Agreement in 2007, which is the largest class action lawsuit ever settled in our country. The part of that Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, there were 5 components. The first was a common experience payment of the CEP that all students received if they could prove that they were part of the residential school system. Now, this also only included students in the federally run residential school system. So there is now, you may hear on the news about students in Eastern Canada, former students in Eastern Canada looking for settlement because they were part of provincial schools that weren't part of this settlement. This was only federally run schools. The other component of the settlement agreement was the independent assessment for students who provided testimony on sexual abuse or on extreme physical abuse. And then there was an extra monetary allotment for students who came forward with those stories, and we heard some of that last week. There was the National Aboriginal Healing Foundation set up to support former students and their families in their healing process, because we can't just say sorry without reaching out and providing support so that people can heal. So the Aboriginal Healing Foundation operates all across Canada to provide supports for families and for survivors. There were commemorative activities across the country. The last one was here in Edmonton, where former students, families, the public would come and hear testimony and do some healing together. And then, of course, the lasting one was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that traveled the country to gather the stories. And a part of the healing process, a part of the atonement was in 2008, our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, rising in the House of Commons and giving a statement of apology. And you have an excerpt from the statement in your participant guide, but I think instead of reading it, it's much more powerful to hear the words from our former Prime Minister himself. So what we're going to do is invite you in a second to open the link, and it'll take you to YouTube, where we'll watch about 2 minutes of the apology. You can watch it in its full, including the opening ceremony, but that's going to take a little bit of time. So I've just cut out, or Dan has cut out a small section for us to look at, about 2 minutes long. And when you're watching this, keep in mind, what is it that Stephen Harper, on behalf of the Canadian government, is apologizing for? What is it maybe that he's missing in that apology? What is your reaction to it? And then we can come back to this page and add any ideas that you would like at the bottom, so that when looking at your comments, I tend to agree that making the apology was important. It was a necessary first step, but indeed that we have to then move beyond, because it is relatively easy to say sorry. It's what comes next that's important, and that's where the Truth and Reconciliation comes in. That's where the calls to action comes in, and that's where we as educators, as my colleague says, us as frontline workers, where our responsibility lies. And we'll just wait about another 30 seconds to see if anybody else has something they want to add, or if you'd like to comment on what other people have added. Excellent. This quote speaks to me as a teacher and speaks to our power as we learn about the truth of residential schools. It's easy to get upset, to get angry, to you feel a little bit of despair, but we are teachers and we are those change agents and we do have power. And I love this quote from Justice Sinclair, who said, "Education is what got us into this mess, but education is also the key to reconciliation. It's what's going to get us out." So that I always take as a source of inspiration and a call for me personally as an educator to use my power as a teacher to make things right for my students. And that's what we're going to look at next, our role as educators. That when you look at the calls to action, there are 11 specific ones dealing with education, with school, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has put onus on us, specifically as educators, to make reconciliation happen. So I want us to think for a little bit, what is our role then as teachers, as educators in Canada? What role do we have in making that apology real, to make the calls to action living in our classroom? So we'll just allow you an opportunity to add any ideas, any thoughts here about our responsibility as educators, and as Justice Sinclair has said, that we do have a special role to play in the education process. So if you have any comments that you would like to add here, we'll give you a few minutes to do that. I believe this is something that we as educators have to think about personally and professionally, and really respond to our obligation and the call that the TRC made specifically to us. So if you have anything that you want to say to add, it's really important that you have time to do that. And when we look at what people are typing here, indeed, it is about relationship building, and that's as educators. We do have our new teacher quality standards coming out soon. And when that happens, there is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit competencies added to that. Within the new TQS and within the First Nations, Métis, Inuit competencies, it talks of relationship and the importance of relationship building. And that is a big piece of our calls to action of our reconciliation, is building those relationships. So that's excellent. And that is it. We can teach the facts, we can teach the history, but without the relationship, do we really have reconciliation? So thank you for sharing your ideas. There's a lot there for us to ponder. That we do have to be mindful of how we're teaching this to our students, and what is the methodology that we're using, so that we do not cause more harm, and we do not re-injure, and that we do not perpetuate stereotypes. For example, when we are talking about residential schools to our students, we also need to be clear that, yes, there were 150,000 approximately students that attended residential schools, but not all First Nations, Métis, or Inuit students attended residential schools. Some, in terms of the Métis, were not allowed to go to residential schools. Some, their parents took them and hid them, or took them off to the track line to avoid the school. There are a lot of students that were not part of the system as well. So we have to be careful that we're not perpetuating any stereotypes, any misconceptions, or recreating harm, especially if we move beyond thinking about it to action and doing reconciliation activities in our classroom. So relationships is important, and then being thoughtful about how we're teaching about residential schools is important as well. And that can be a little fearful, especially if you have students, let's say, that are in Div 1 or Div 2. How do you speak of such things? And we do have our new curriculum coming out with residential schools, worked into it from K to 12, and we will have a scope and sequence from Alberta Education that will give us guidance in that. So this is not something that you also think you have to go out tomorrow and start teaching with your students if it's not part of your curriculum already. that at this stage, we really need to be thinking about our own personal and professional development. And yes, we're teachers, and yes, we want to jump right into the classroom setting, but we also really need to be mindful that we're not rushing into things and that we are not creating more harm if we jump in without a lot of thought, without a lot of communication with community, without going as a school collective to. There are, we'll look at in a second, a lot of resources that are out there. If you on your personal journey and professional journey are ready, if your school is ready, if your district is ready to move in on this, and you are not going to wait for Alberta Ed to release their specific scope and sequence. That's what we're going to move on to next, is looking at the action, what we can do as teachers. Again, it's really important for you to consider there's a lot that is out there already. You're not starting from scratch. There's a lot to help you understand residential schools at a more personal and professional level. These past two sessions, we're really just scratching the surface of what's out there, and there's so much more to learn and to know. This is, as outlined in the TQS, a career-long learning journey for us. So please don't feel that you are rushed into learning this yourself or rushed into bringing this into the classroom. But if you are ready, or when you are ready, there are a lot of resources that are out there to help and support you, and I want to run through some of them with you. First, some ideas of what teachers have done in the past. So myself and my teammates, when we have done reconciliation with our students, we've shared a list of things that we have done before, and in a second I'll ask for you to share any ideas that you know of or you've heard, because talking teacher to teacher, we can gather lots of good ideas and we can piggyback on each other's ideas. We've had one of my colleagues was a grade 4 teacher, and she, after reading some literature with her students, had them write letters to survivors. And she had actually her grandmother, I believe, was a residential school survivor, and had them respond back to the letters, which was quite interesting. We've had grade 6 teachers do research projects on residential schools as part of a book study that they were doing in language arts. In my district, in Edmonton Public, all of the schools were asked to post a letter of apology up in a prominent place in their school. So we have, when you come into my school, the apology done up on a big mural. There is a ton of children's literature that is usable from K right up to 12. For example, in my last school, it was a K to 9 school, and we used a Shishi Echo for kindergarten right to grade 9. Of course, the conversations that we had at different grade levels was different, but we used that same resource, so we had common language in our teaching staff and in our students when we were addressing residential schools. You can, of course, if you have connections to elders and to former students, many of them are at the point in their healing journey where they will want to come and share the truth with their students. Be careful, though, inviting elders and former students, that we do not reharm. So you should have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit coordinators in your school district, reaching out to them and asking them of how to go about who is an elder that is at their point to share their story for your school, and how to go about offering proper protocol, offering to invite them into your school. They'll be able to help you out with that. But if you do have that at your disposal, having an elder come in or a former student come in and talk to your staff or to your students is very, very powerful. And there are so many wonderful elders out there who are so courageous to come forward and share their stories. If you can't get that, there's also video of survivors speaking, and they're recorded on the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation's website that you can access. Be careful if you choose that, because some of the stories are not suitable for students, so you really have to preview and pick what's appropriate. Of course, there's lots of ready-made resources where teachers, our plates are overflowing with responsibility and with things to do. So we want to point you in a second to resources that are out there and ready-made for you, that if this is something you want to do with your students or your school, there is lots already done for you. So before we move into showing you resources, I want to give you an opportunity, if you've done any reconciliation work or residential school work in your classroom, or you've heard of colleagues who have, if you want to share those ideas with each other now, because sometimes we can spark ideas in each other, or we can share something that we hadn't thought of before that might be helpful. So we'll just give you a second or two if you would like to take your typing tool and add anything down here that you've seen or heard or have done yourself with success in your classroom. Okay, we have a few ideas down. I would like to move on looking at the time to share some other ideas that are out there and places that you can go as you are examining this for your own school, your own classroom, for now or in the future. There are a lot of really good resources ready made for you. Some you may have heard before, some you knew. This should be, the list of these resources should be in your participant guide. If not, you can access these slides and explore them further on your own, or at the end we will give you our connect information and you can contact me and we can guide you in the right direction. So there's lots that's out there that's pre-made, ready with lessons that are good for K to 12 that you can easily access and use in your school, in your division, or in your classroom. For example, a heart garden. The little guys in Div 1 really love to do this. And that is with the Project of Heart. The Heart Garden is just what it says. Students make little hearts. They write messages on it. You can plant them in your dead flower bed outside of your school. Kids can take them home. You can put them on the wall. You can put them in vases in your learning commons. Lots of really good examples of Heart Garden. You can also plant real flowers, or you can have real flowers that the kids grow and then give away. Heart Garden is a really excellent idea, and you can see lots of good samples of that when you Google a Heart Garden. Project of Heart is, the Heart Garden is part of, does some amazing things. If you've seen their tiles, and you can see a picture of that in the top right-hand corner. You can order little wooden tiles that the students color on. There's ready-made lesson plans for you to use. For my school, it was quite expensive in a school of over 1,000 kids to order tiles, so we had old hockey sticks donated and our construction teacher kit and sliced it up into little pieces, and we used those. And with the tiles, you can make mosaics. You can take boxes and glue the tiles on. All sorts of things you can do creatively with the tiles once they're created as a commemorative piece to residential school experience. Again, Project of Heart has lots of ready-made lesson plans that you can adapt to K to 12 with their tiles. Kitchen Table Dialogue, it's downloadable resources that talk about lessons on how you can talk about reconciliation, talk about residential schools with your students. It's really good for the higher grades. So I'd invite you to Google Kitchen Table Dialogue, and you'll see some really good ready-made ideas for that are downloadable. Orange Shirt Day, I'm sure many of you have heard of that before, and there are, with the Orange Shirt Day campaign, ready-made lessons and videos that you can use in your classroom, and that's a really good way to kick off the year if you're planning on a year of reconciliation activities. Start with Orange Shirt Day in the fall, a really good place to go. There's a ton of literature out there, so if you do have First Nations, Métis, Inuit money in your budget, in your library to buy resources or for your classroom, there's a ton of resources that are good from kindergarten, the one in the bottom right-hand corner, When We Were Alone, that just came out, right up to a Gord Downie Secret Path that is good to use with higher grades. As I've said, Shishi Echo, the book in the top left-hand side, I've used that with K to 9. The Arctic Stories, there's some excellent stories in there that we've done with grade 2s. Really good resources that are adaptable. And just because something like Shishi Echo is written for younger kids, you can order, or you can use that with the higher grades as well. The conversations that you have and the lessons you have around it, of course, are much more sophisticated, but the learning is quite adaptable. And the Shishi Echo 2 is part of an ebook that the BC Teachers Federation has done. If you haven't seen that, Google it, check it out. It's absolutely amazing. And they've taken Shishi Echo and created a little vignette movie of it, which is really powerful. I've used that with teachers, and it's very moving. Again, you can use it from the lower grades right on up because what they get out of the video and the messages they get are very different. There's also a lot of websites that have ready-made resources for you. The place that I would suggest you go to first is the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That is housed in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba, but they have on their website amazing information that you can use. If you go to their main page, at the bottom, you'll see that you can click on Alberta and it will give you all of the residential schools that were in Alberta. If you click on those, it'll take you through any of the documents and pictures that they have from that school, all of the archives. It's pretty amazing for you personally and professionally to look at. Be careful using that page with students because they can get to areas that you don't want them to get to awfully fast. We've had teachers use that before for research projects on residential schools. I have had an experience with a colleague on that page, and she knew that her grandmother went to residential school. She clicked on the residential school and actually found pictures of her grandmother, which was quite moving for her. So we have to be careful using that master page of the NCTR. But what I love about this site, for all teachers, if you go into the education link at the top, and they have done an excellent job to create themselves as a one-stop shop for residential school resources. So if you go to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, you click on education, they're hyperlinked to all sorts of excellent resources, including things like a Project of Heart, like Orange Shirt Day, like Healing Forest, all sorts of places that are already hyperlinked for you. They've also created a bunch of videos that you can use that are right on their webpage that you can take and use in your classroom. Excellent place to go if you're looking for resources but don't want to spend your Friday night Googling. Where Are the Children is an excellent resource, but again, be careful with the videos because some of those, they are quite explicit in their description. It's a good place for you to go for your own personal learning. The timeline in Where Are the Children is excellent to use. You could create a timeline to use in your classroom if you are at that level of learning. There is one spot there where you can order a kit, but they are all out of kits, so you won't be able to do that. They should put that link up there, but they haven't yet. National Film Board of Canada has excellent resources as well. If you are a member, I sign up for free, you access a ton of resources that you can use on not only reconciliation, but all foundational knowledge of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Excellent place to go. Canadian Encyclopedia is a great place for research students on residential schools. If you want to know, and two more on residential schools before we go into the detail. Forgotten Métis is affiliated with Where Are the Children, but it focuses on the Métis experience, and then We Were So Far Away, again, same related to Forgotten Métis, except it's the Inuit experience. And the Métis, Inuit, and First Nations all had different and unique experiences in residential schools, so I'd invite you to look at those as well. Historica Canada is an excellent resource to go to, not only for social teachers, because they also have the Heritage Minutes there. So they have the latest one in residential schools, the Chani Wenjack, but they have excellent resources that I've used in my science classes as well on Historica Canada. Some really good resources that you can access there, not just on residential schools, but a really excellent site to go to. And for your own personal learning, the Walking Together digital resource from Alberta Education is an excellent place to start. If you are wanting to know more but not sure where to go, I'd suggest you go there. That is an excellent place for foundational knowledge. Beware, the site is huge, and they tell you right at the beginning it is for teacher professional development, not for classroom use. There are some good videos that if you vet and look at, you can use in your classroom. And it talks to you about things like how to offer protocol if you want to ask a survivor or former student to come to your classroom and speak. It talks about, there are some bits on residential schools and the impact. And there are a ton of excellent videos where Métis, First Nations, and Inuit elders and knowledge keepers are talking about their experience, about their worldviews. Really excellent resource if you're looking to learn more on a general level. It's not just about residential schools, but if you haven't been there, I strongly suggest that Walking Together digital resource. Now, when we look at this, thing to remember, when we can be overwhelmed easily by all that is out there and the calls to action, asking us to step up in our classrooms and do work on residential schools and foundational knowledge, it can be overwhelming. But remember, this isn't something that we have to do tomorrow. And it's not just what we do specifically in our classrooms in terms of projects like Orange Shirt Day. I like, again, Justice Sinclair's words saying that it is not just these big projects that we do, it's in our daily conversations, in the words that we use, in our attitudes and interactions with each other. That relationship piece, that is I think, the most important part of reconciliation. So really keeping his ideas in mind about what we say and what we do every day with our students, with our classrooms, within our communities, that's really critical and an important piece, in fact, the most important piece of reconciliation, I think. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope we've had some ideas that you can take away and use in your classroom. I will stay on a little bit after if you care to chat or get on your microphone and ask some questions. You can follow us on Instagram. If you are interested in contributing ideas more or learning more about the Walking Together Project, our Education for Reconciliation, or about residential schools, we're also on Twitter, so you can follow us there at ATA Indigenous. And you can also go to the Alberta Teachers Association main page. When you do that, the third heading over, if you click on it, you'll see Walking Together as one of the drop-down menus, or you can just put this link into your Google. We have a web page through the ATA where we are uploading all of the resources that we're developing for residential schools, for reconciliation, for foundational knowledge to help support teachers right across the province. Check back often. It lists the resources that we're creating for you, the worksheets that we're creating. We've just begun the web page, so we're just starting to populate it. So bookmark that and go back often. We want to make sure that we have a ton of resources on our Walking Together web page that you can access for your own personal learning and for you to use in the classroom. For example, we are doing things like stepping stones and fact sheets. So if you're uncertain of even words to use, do I use Indigenous? Do I use Aboriginal? Is it okay for me to say Native? What about Indian? Add a taboo word. We have a stepping stone just on terminology that you can access. We're going to be bringing ones up any day now on treaty and what treaty is, what it means, on offering protocol to elders, on looking at misconceptions that may be out there surrounding Indigenous Canadians. So there's a lot of good resources that we're going to be adding. Please check back often. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I hope that you've learned one or two ideas and that you have some things that you can take back for your own personal and professional